Welcome to the Atheist Podcast. I'm Erin.
And I'm Kelley. Atheist is where we will explore American cultural trends through the lenses of a devout theist
and a devout atheist. We will discuss the messiness of being human,
the latest in social science, psychology, and American culture,
and what any of it has to do with Homo sapiens' longtime preoccupation with religion. We are thrilled to have Oliver Burkeman joining us on the podcast today, the renowned author and journalist known for his insightful perspectives on happiness, productivity, and the human condition. As a journalist, Burkeman wrote a weekly column for The Guardian called This Column Will Change Your Life for over a decade. His unique approach to writing combines philosophical inquiry, psychological research, and the personal experiences to offer readers a fresh perspective on navigating the complexities of modern life. His books include The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, where Burkeman challenges conventional wisdom and helps readers understand that it is our relentless pursuit of happiness that is in fact making us miserable, and that there's a different path to deep contentment, which involves embracing failure, pessimism, insecurity, and uncertainty, the very things we spend our lives trying to avoid. His latest work, which is now out in paperback, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, offers a fresh perspective on our finitude and how to derive deep meaning from the limited time we have on this planet. The book challenges the modern culture of trying to get everything done and encourages us to recognize that this race is not only futile, it is simply a false story that we are telling ourselves, and it is within our power to choose differently. Burkeman is an author that inspires his readers, like Kelley and I, to engage in introspection and personal growth, and invites all of us to reconsider our assumptions about happiness, success, and the pursuit of a more fulfilling existence. Thank you, Oliver, for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks for that great introduction.
Well, we are huge fangirls, and it's kind of embarrassing how excited we are to have you to talk to. And I just said to Erin before we got on, I was like, if you had told us 6 months ago, when we were sitting around drinking beer and talking about your book, that we would be sitting interviewing you, we would be a little
the reality can only disappoint, I'm sure.
well, we beg to differ. So I wanted to start with a question about kind of the origin story for this book, for 4,000 Weeks. I heard somebody say the other day about an idea that they were chewing on, that this is an idea I've been thinking about for 5 or 10 years. And we don't really hear people say things like that today. People are kind of regurgitating information pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I love so much about your book, is it feels like the culmination of a lot of deep thinking over several years. And so it doesn't come off as a pop psychology book. It really comes off as a wisdom book. So I was wondering, if there was a moment that was precipitous in kind of sending you in this direction of looking at your relationship to time.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it sort of brings up all sorts of somewhat interesting points about how creativity works, doesn't it? Because my experience with writing always is that I sort of get an intellectual grasp of something that I want to talk about almost before it's been reached its full fruition as some sort of life experience to have, right? So, or that it takes a lot longer to sort of live into this kind of insights that you get from that process. I suppose this is a convoluted way of saying that on some level, I had, I think, been interested in and struggling with the question of time and how to feel like I was doing what I ought to be doing with my time and all the rest of it for a very long time, for certainly my sort of basically all my life as a teenager through to adulthood and beyond. Then what happened was I started when I there's a very sort of down to earth level of this, which is you want to write a book, you look at the patterns that have been emerging. I looked at the patterns that have been emerging in the columns I've been writing, and I saw that the ones that really compelled me were all about time and limitation and the idea of embracing limitation. Then I sort of put together the book proposal and sold the book proposal. Like then, in a way that I didn't really know was going to happen when I first came up with the book proposal, I, in short order, became a father, and then the pandemic happened, and all these kind of major things that really made me understand the nature of the of struggles with time happened after that. So what I'm trying to say is that it's almost sort of spooky to me in a way, the way that you sort of get these kind of intimations of what's important, and then suddenly your life demonstrates, oh yes, they're really important. So I don't know if that was a precipitating moment. There's also sort of moments of crisis when I was like, okay, my attitude to time is not working out for me and I need a new one. And I write in the book about, sitting on a park bench in Prospect Park here in Brooklyn, where I'm speaking to you from now, and trying to, very normal thing for me then, sort of anxiously trying to figure out how I was going to get all the things done that I felt I had to get done by the end of that week, and just suddenly being struck by the thought, like, oh, it's impossible. Oh, it can't be done. I'm just trying to do something impossible.
Right.
And experiencing the liberation of that insight, I think maybe that was a precipitating moment.
Yeah.
A long answer, but there you go. Hopefully there's something in there.
No, that's a good one. How is the birth of your child changed your relationship to time?
Well, I don't think I have. It's not in a particularly original sense, right? I mean, you have some vague sense that your daily time is limited. You feel overwhelmed by things. Then you become a parent, and it's not necessarily anything that isn't equally true for non-parents. It's just that it's incredibly impossible to ignore. Firstly, the kind of a minimum of what, half your discretionary time is immediately eliminated. I think that probably depends on how people share the work of parenting, but that's a minimum. And then secondly, that any attempt to sort of schedule your life and decide when it is that you're going to be sleeping, when it is that you're going to be able to focus deeply on something, or that wasn't my son, or attend to him and his needs, like all that is out the window. That sense that you were sort of scheduling things and then carrying out the schedule, which never actually really worked very well in hindsight, even prior to this, they just became for me sort of unignorable. I think all of that, it probably goes at least twice for the experience of motherhood as a fatherhood, but it was still pretty intense for me, and remains so. And to be clear, it's not that I regret it. It's that you are sort of, it's borne in on you not only how little control you have, but actually then how many of the best moments come from surrendering to that fact.
Yes.
Yeah. We're both parents, so we totally understand.
I'm on the kind of the other side though, where I'm starting to get my time back, and that's kind of amazing too.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
We have a toddler. We have a 3-year-old, so
right.
I'm right where you are.
Our son is 6, so it's still, it's an interesting moment, but actually, to say that I have acres of discretionary time would be inaccurate.
So this podcast, the theme of our podcast is exploring where people find connection, especially people who have different belief systems. And in the work that you create, you pull on such different wisdom traditions. And we're curious if you could talk to us about whether or not you come from any specific belief system, and maybe what your background was as far as a spiritual practice.
Yeah, sure. I feel like a sort of terrible hodgepodge, though I think that's probably true for very many people. To the extent that I was raised religiously, which is very limited extent, I was raised as a Quaker. So, and certainly in the UK anyway, Quakerism is that corner of Christianity where being totally atheist is apparently completely acceptable. So it wasn't I think that might accurately describe, for example, my father's outlook. But I did sort of really I think I was shaped quite a bit by some aspects of Quakerism to do with the kind of spirit of equality and democracy of it's not like everything hangs on the priest or the minister. It's kind of everybody has a sort of equal role to play in it. And then I don't know if it is a spiritual, how relevant it is spiritually that my Jewish on my father's side of the family. I think that my paternal grandmother's experience of escaping the Nazis definitely I now realize had sort of like through the generation impact on me, in the sense that I think she probably had a extremely anxious parenting style that has come down that is a part of the explanation for my sort of spending large swathes of my life going thinking that something nebulous and terrible was going to happen at any moment. So there's that. Honestly, the thing that I have spent the most in the sort of spiritual tradition that I have spent the most active time doing anything practical related to is Buddhism in terms of meditation retreats and things like that. I certainly wouldn't call myself a Buddhist. So yeah, that's the hodgepodge. The Jewish Buddhist thing is not even surprising. That's like that's a hugely popular intersection of faiths. But I guess the Quaker bit is slightly less.
But even the Quakers, right, in their practice, there is a lot of waiting and silence and listening in that, like in a Quaker meeting, right?
Yeah,
there's no like schedule. You're not
right. No, it is a challenge to, if you want things to unfold on a specific timetable, well, that makes you feel safe and secure. It is a bit of a challenge to that. Yeah, I think there are interesting. Maybe this is a detour, but I think there's some interesting downsides to that sort of non-organized. I know that I think the majority of Quakers on a global level actually do programmed worship, but I'm talking about the tradition in the UK, same as the East Coast, I think, anyway, of the US, where it's very unprogrammed. There are downsides to that, which is that when you remove the structures from things, it's not always just that everyone has a equal say, but just the people with the biggest egos run the show,
who are willing to
right.
willing to say the spirit is moving in them. And
yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So it's just strange that it would always be in the same handful of people, right?
That's right. Well, in that vein, we're curious who've been your formative teachers, whether those are spiritual teachers or just intellectual teachers. Who do you kind of count as sitting around the table of your thinking?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, and I'm always stumble a bit on that word because by and large, figures who died a long time before I was born. Although not always, actually. I suppose some of the influences that immediately spring to mind there. I mean, Carl Jung, maybe, obviously in some ways, but that sort of that perspective on psychology and psychotherapy that does straddle spiritual and secular worlds in quite an important way, I think. I've been really influenced by the work of a Jungian psychotherapist called James Hollis, who I've been fortunate enough to get to meet and talk with since discovering his work, and there's an interview between me and him included in the paperback edition of my book that you just mentioned. So that's a big privilege. I think I've been really into reading stuff by Dogen, the founder of the Soto Zen tradition, I think, who had some sort of seems to have had some ideas about the nature of time and our experience of time that you know took me writing my whole book to just begin to maybe glimpse, and then I discovered his work, and it's like, oh yes, it was all here expressed in kind of extraordinarily vivid terms. So there's a few. Part of the reason I find this difficult to answer is that like I could list 50 people. I'm not going to. Don't worry. You've got, but they often don't seem for me to sort of distill down into like it's the 4 or 5 people who are I seem to have just ended up being a sort of very, very eclectic in the way that I draw on things and people. So they're almost like too many to mention, and not that many who form the sort of pantheon of 3 or 4, I guess.
Yeah. So just read the book and we can see all those people kind of
those
in
influences.
there. Yeah.
Right.
I think it's interesting too. I mean, I don't know if you probably don't recall this. I'm sure you get fan mail all the time, but when I read your book the first time, and this was probably about a year ago, I sent you an email and you replied because you're very gracious, which is also why you're here right now. But I just said that like that this book is the antidote to the modern culture as we're experiencing it, and is just a voice that I think that we need in every generation to be reminded of. And I'm sure a lot of the teachers that you have had are those voices from the past that we're trying to remind people, hey guys, slow down. Like this is it. This is here. It's here and now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's it's really true that it is reminding rather than like coming up with some new thought. And so really when I think about the list of people who've influenced me, it's as much a form of expression or a way of writing that just happens to, for whatever reason, cause me to see the thing that they're pointing to. And that also leads to the strange other experience of kind of reading people's work who has had a huge effect on other people, and it not really resonating with oneself. And it's just some very often, I think, it's some very subtle stylistic thing. So yeah, it's been amazing hearing from people in response to my book who clearly on some level experience these things like me, and so my putting it into those words has been powerful for them. There's a really amazing, like, people say to me, like, that they're grateful to realize it wasn't just them, but that's an experience I have too, right? It's like the experience of realizing you weren't quite such a lone freak as you may have imagined. And in a way, that's where the therapy is, right? It's not in like, and now do this or follow this technique. It's just like, know that we are all in this same slightly absurd boat.
Speaking of that, as far as reception to the book, I'm curious if there are common things that people say to you, or if there are strings in our collective unconscious that have been plucked. Like, what are those themes that come up for people when they reach out to you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Some of this will get a bit mixed up with responses to my newsletter, where I explore some related themes. I don't keep those sort of clear in my mind. But I mean, one thing that's really always fascinating to me, although I totally resonate with it, I see why it happens, but is the sense that that people reading what I've written feel that they have some form of permission as a result of reading it to, acknowledge that they're overwhelmed, or acknowledge that the thing they've been trying to do is impossible, or that, it would be a totally valid, meaningful use of their life were they to do 3 of the 12 things that they think they have to spend their lives on. And there's something odd about that, right? It's like, I'm not anybody to give permission. It's like, some random British guy. Like, it's not like being given permission by your boss or your parent or something like that. And I think maybe really that idea of that, again, that notion of permission, it's not really about authority. It's more about finding that there's somebody else, expressing the way that you experience things, and therefore feeling that it wouldn't be sort of going out on a limb to have those thoughts or to live in that way. So I'm always really struck by that. And then also whenever I write about the sense of kind of this feels quite sort of personal and between me and my therapist kind of material, but whenever I write about the sense of being sort of crushed by a feeling of obligation in life, right? The feeling of like all these things that you have to do just to count as a sort of minimally adequate person and have had the right to exist that day. You know, whenever I sort of go slightly out in that direction, thinking like, oh no, I'm going to finally, this is the newsletter where I'm going to expose myself as, just having very weird issues that nobody else has. It's like, that's when there's a huge outpouring of like, yes, the sense that of sort of the sense of needing to do a lot more things just to get to this sort of baseline sense of adequacy. And that is an idea that's where my sort of Christian curious side in, because that is obviously where the sort of ideas about grace make a very sort of powerful intervention. The idea that one is sort of already enough and doesn't necessarily need to find a better productivity system in order to reach the level of being enough.
I feel like Kelley will have a good follow-up to that second theme. I have a story I want to tell you about the first theme that you just touched on, which is the permission structure. So I seriously have bought like 24 copies of your book, and I've just like handed out to the people I care about. And a friend of mine,
I'm extremely grateful for that, and I don't even have like an affiliate system, right?
I just think it's one of those books that's it's so wise and it's so accessible, and it packs so much power in such like for being such a short volume, which I think for a lot of people, you give them this enormous book and they're like, oh God, I'm so overwhelmed. I could never even, and they're like, okay, I could read this. But the story, so a friend of mine had taken a sabbatical for work and she's not sure if she's going to go back. And I was like, so what prompted that? And she's like, well, you gave me that book.
I don't want to say I've got thousands of stories like this, but I know of at least 2 other people, like either known to me or to a friend of mine who seem to have changed their employment situation as a result of the book. And I'm always like, so hope it works out.
Yeah, right. That's a lot of pressure.
I know. She's fine. She's in a situation that it was a good thing.
Awesome.
A new adventure. So
if I could get my husband to slow down just for like a couple hours to read your book, just, I think it would change his situation too. But I think we're on that train until it ends. In terms of, the beautiful comment you just made about grace and that, we are enough and that we already exist in that space of grace. One of the things that we found really exciting was when Erin emailed you and one of your connection points to us was that we had already interviewed Belden Lane and that you liked, that you resonated with his work. And I just wondered if you could share a little bit about kind of your experience reading him.
I'm going to be honest and say that it was a long time ago.
Yeah,
I came to that book through one of David Brooks's books where it's quoted repeatedly. So I don't know how many of the thoughts that I have about the experience of being in wild nature and feeling feeling something that is very spiritual in that context comes from when I read that book or when I read David Brooks riffing on that book, or just from my experiences. We live now in not right now. I'm talking to you from the US, but we live now in the North York Moors, which is a sort of the national park in the north of England. In Britain, the national park is a different designation, so lots of people live in them, and there are no bears. I mean, not only is it a landscape dotted with the sort of monuments to early Christianity, but that is the context in which it is easiest to feel in some kind of conversation with nature, reality, all the people who have been in those places for centuries before you. But to say that I'm getting that from Belden Lane or from any specific sources, sort of slightly lost in the mists of time for me now.
Yeah. Well, it's good to know that I didn't realize he was so referenced in Brooks's book. So that'll be something to look forward to. So
Yeah, no, that was my way in. I think it must have been The Second Mountain, but it might have been The Road to Character. I think it was The Second Mountain where he where I was introduced to that book. Yeah.
Well, one question that I did not touch on earlier, and this was sort of like, probing as you were growing up, but we were curious about what you were taught about time growing up, if you were taught anything, or what you observed, or what the culture was in your, household growing up.
Yeah. This is where I always feel a little bit like I'm being a bad son, because my parents are very much alive and I love them to bits, and I had an absolutely wonderful childhood. I do think I internalized some pretty anxiety-inducing aspects about time. I think I write about this a bit in the book, so it's already out there. I think I definitely grew up in a context where there was a lot of emphasis was placed on sort of having things planned out and getting your ducks in a row and leaving enough time to get to places. And I joke in the book that there is a real Onion story with the headline "Dad suggests arriving at airport 14 hours early," which is I joke is my upbringing. It wasn't 14 hours, but that kind of thing. And actually, I think you can make some fairly straightforward connections between that and my grandmother's experience leaving Nazi Germany. But the general idea is definitely this one that, like, it's a good thing to try to get a handle on what's coming and when you're going to do what, and make sure that things aren't going to go awry. And as I've since sort of figured out, at least somewhat, this is it's a fool's errand, right? I mean, it's not that some element of planning your trip or something isn't sensible. Of course it is, but like that kind of emotional investment in the idea that you know what's coming down the pike and you've got it all under control. Like, either it doesn't go that way and you're more sort of thrown by the fact that it doesn't go that way, or it does go that way, but then you've just got the next bit of the future to be trying to bring under your control, right? It never ends until one day, I guess it does end. But it's not it's a quest for a kind of reassurance that you can't ever reach. And then I think the other thing that I sort of learned, as one learns if you sort of grow up to be a sort of good student and study when you should, and you get good results as a result of that, it's very much conditioned into you that, like, using your time wisely for future goals is an important thing. Again, it is, and maybe there are some people who could do with more of that message inside them, but I in general have had to sort of unlearn it a bit to be able to contemplate finding satisfaction in the moment rather than always just over the next hill.
That's
you as well. Does that resonate?
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah. So one of my teachers, you quote in the first like maybe 15 pages of the book, which I was really excited about. Richard Rohr.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So I just finished a program with him, a 2-year program with him, and you quote him a couple times in the book. But one of the things on our first day of class that he said, which I feel like is highly relatable to this book, is he said, "The greatest ally of God is reality. It's the primary voice of God." And that was just, of the 2 years, like, that's one of the things I just, held on to.
Yeah.
And just that, the opposite of reality is this kind of distractible state, this distracted state that we live in, either of, we distract ourselves with pleasure, or we distract ourselves with pain. And I think you even talk about that, like the addiction we have to our anxiety too, and in our culture. And then
Right.
for me, in the book, I'm going to read. Is it okay if I read you to you? This quote about
No,
patience.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So you say patience becomes a form of power. In a world geared for hurry, the capacity to resist the urge to hurry, to allow things to take the time they take, is a way to gain purchase on the world, to do the work that counts, and to derive satisfaction from the doing itself instead of deferring all your fulfillment for the future. And I can't tell you how many times I've used that quote. I work as a spiritual director, so I have
Right.
clients, and I have quoted that to so many people. Just this idea that in order to live in reality, we just have to be patient with what is, right?
Right. Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so that just, to me, uh, that idea of that equanimous state. Um,
Hmm.
So I'm curious, and I know you said it's about knowing, like, it's about identifying with each other and going, oh,
Hmm.
you're in that boat too, I'm in that
Yeah.
boat. But I wonder if there are any practices that you use to cultivate that sense of patience and looking at things as they are.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm constantly experimenting with different ones, and I can sort of answer that question on any level, from kind of, you know the shock tactic that I write about doing in the book, where I went to look at a single painting in the Harvard Art
Yes.
Museums for
Hmm.
three unbroken hours. We can definitely talk about that. That's kind of like, you want to make yourself learn the discomfort of not uh, moving fast. That's but also the great benefits uh, of slowing down like that. That's a great one. I would say that one of the key things, just in my sort of day to day life, and especially my work life, is really trying to let myself fall back down into kind of a sequential, doing one thing at a time kind of approach. It was a big deal for me when I realized that the thing that stops me focusing on one thing at a time is not it's not really best described as like, oh, the temptations of distraction and social media or something like that. It's much better described as like the anxiety that comes from making all the other ones wait, basically. So like,
Yeah.
if you have 10 projects, all of which feel like they're incredibly urgent,
Mhm.
and that you're sort of, it's a bad situation if you don't get them all done in a given amount of time. um, the truth is obviously that the only way to, or the best way to get through as many as you can in the time available is one after another. The truth is that if you've got enough time to do one of them, then one is better than zero,
Mhm.
and one thing done in reality is better than 20 things kind of
Mm.
um, sort of forced into your schedule on a level of fantasy and then never actually implemented. So that's sort of, it's not even going slow. That's the funny thing, right? It's just going at the speed that things take to
Yeah.
to do. And falling in, it's an uncomfortable mindset, I still find, to sort of return to, but the discomfort doesn't last. And that knowing that, today I'm going to do this, try to do this and this and this. That's all.
That's it.
And it's
Mhm.
totally inadequate if the standard of adequacy is all the things that I feel I have to do, but that just doesn't work, right? That's just that leads to the opposite result. I just wrote a few days ago now a newsletter about an experiment where sort of returning to overwhelm and wanting to get away from that feeling again, and or move through it. I experimented with sort of really radically limiting the number of hours I was doing any work
Yeah.
in a day. Um, and all sorts of caveats. Lots of people are not in the position to experiment in that way. It's good fortune that I can, but it's not fun, right? If you feel overwhelmed with things, making yourself only do 4 hours of them and then spend the rest of your free time, discretionary time, like going for walks or swimming, like, doesn't feel like feels like you're doing something illicit.
Right.
Um, but what it's actually doing, I believe, is training that sort of muscle that says, I am limited, I am finite. The best thing I can do is sort of step fully into that and do a few things instead of constantly sort of skating over the top of them in an attempt to
Mm,
to to get to the point. It's all about control, right? It's like
yeah.
seeking the feeling. Well, I think we will generally um, go a very, very long way to in service of that feeling of being in control, even if it's obviously totally detrimental to things like, feeling happy or
Mm.
being not being a jerk to other people or anything else. Yeah.
I've started this summer. I a friend of mine who is of a um an older generation than I
Mm.
said to me once, I only do 3 things a day. And I was like, that is insane. What are you talking, like, how can you only do 3 things a day? But now this summer, and I'm about a year from retirement.
Right.
And so I'm starting to kind of try to move into that space. So this summer I've tried just doing 3 things a day. And so it might be 3 hours or it might be 6 hours, but
Right.
only 3 things on my calendar. And then
Yeah.
because I find if I have that 4th thing, I'm
Yeah.
like resentful of that 4th thing when it comes,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
And I'm
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
like, I wanna I wanna cancel. But
Yeah.
if that 4th thing comes up spontaneously and I have the energy, then I can say yes to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if it's on there, if it's on my calendar, then I'm like, I'm
Yeah.
just all day, like, regretting it's there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know exactly what you mean. That capacity to sort of, even if it was something you really wanted to do or you decided to
Yeah.
do yourself, right? Yeah, one ends up really hating one's oppressor even when that's yourself, right?
Yeah.
That's the part of it that always seems. And again, yes, it's because you wanted a certain kind of control over your time, and you took it away from yourself
Mhm.
by putting it in the end. That's really interesting.
That kind of prompts for me one of the things that I have probably quote to other people the most about the book, or when I'm trying to describe it to other people, is um, that concept of the joy of missing out rather than
Right,
the
right.
fear of missing out. And because, as you say, it's the fact that we have a limited time and that we're choosing to do certain things and like neglect the things that are less
Hmm.
important, that bestows meaning on those things that we do choose.
Right.
And um and then makes us more attentive to those things that we are choosing, or hopefully makes us more attentive to those things that we are choosing. So I guess for you, if you as observing that as a practice in your own life, are there things that you're able to see more clearly when, like, using that practice, or like maybe are there things that you could see now that you couldn't see before?
Yeah, I mean, I think the right way to describe my day-to-day experience of this stuff is that I fall back into sort of the anxious, controlly mindset fairly frequently, but it's much quicker than it used to be that I can see where I'm going and sort of see through it a little bit and sort of uh, not go down that rabbit hole. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess that I've tended to write and talk about the joy of missing out in the context of choosing among good things like fun experiences, right? So it's like the fear of missing out is this notion that like there are great experiences happening somewhere or important, you know, things that you could be a part of, or I don't know, people you could be dating, and you want to try to implicit in the concept of fear, I guess, is this idea that you want to rule that out from happening. It's like if you're not careful, you might miss out on things.
Mm.
And so my sort of first response to that is always that moments contemplation of the relationship between our finitude and the infinite variety of experiences on offer is such that missing out is inevitable. It's not
Mhm.
something to be feared, it's something to be seen as inevitable, and that it's happening anyway, right? So you can sort of slip into this joy of missing out mindset or not. Either way, you know, you're still making tough choices and doing one thing with a period of time when you could have been doing one of another, myriad things. And so, yeah, I think what I get to sort of one thing that I notice when I can be in that mindset is, firstly, the things that I find fulfilling are not the things that I necessarily tell myself I find fulfilling. So one thing that often tends to happen in this way is that you're going to choose something seemingly more mundane than something else, right? You're going to, uh, you know, deny yourself some potentially sort of exciting seeming night out somewhere because you're going to stay home and do the things that come with family life and raising kids. And so you can be understanding that this is what's going on in terms of sacrificing lots of things for something else seems to me to give some extra depth to that seemingly mundane experience. And then I think if you follow that thought all the way, you might conclude that like no experience is mundane, right? In the sense that we tend to mean it, that it's almost, this is a radical way of putting it, but like it's almost like it doesn't matter exactly what you're doing with your time. What matters is that you understand that you could have been doing lots of other things and you're doing this one and you're here for this one. And I think, to push that point to its limit, there is, and I write about this bit in the book as well, right? I think there's even an argument that sort of actively physically painful experiences are less agonizing to the extent that one's full attention can be held on them.
One of the things that I have written a lot about and studied quite a bit is the mental health crisis for young people. And I think that idea, I kind of wonder if you've thought about how that kind of fear of missing out plays into that the relationship we have to social media and like the explosion of of seemingly endless possibilities does for us as human beings. I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to know your thoughts, but yes, I really do think it's all part of the same thing. I think something that interests me a lot is specifically the kind of phenomenology of the feeling of being in digital spaces, that this sense that you have, or that I have anyway, of it's very easy to see how you would feel that the limitations don't apply, right, in all sorts of different ways, and you get this in sort of the disinhibition of people being truly obnoxious online. That's one form of it, but also just that notion that like it doesn't seem right that there ought to be any limitations to what you can do, where you can go, who you can present yourself as being, all the rest of it. And so I've got to believe that sort of makes it harder to have to encounter the different ways in which material reality does limit us. So the example I always give, I don't know if there's really any research into this, but it's got to be the case. I just can't believe it isn't the case that people's level of impatience at things like queuing or traffic jams is ramped up when the rest of the time they're able to spend their life in this sort of with this sort of godlike phenomenology of just sort of moving liquidly through cyberspace. So I think I'm sure that has something to do with this. Obviously, then there's just, and maybe this speaks to your interest, you tell me, but like the algorithmic side of this, the fact that we have this sense that we're sort of encountering a different dimension of reality, but actually it's a completely manipulated reality. It's designed to make you feel worse FOMO. It's designed to make you have worse thoughts about your social acceptability or your body image or whatever it might be. It's not just that you happened to find some people living more exciting, glamorous lives or looking more attractive than you or whatever it is. It's that well, originally it was that those specific people were highlighted for to come into your feed, and now with AI they won't even be real people. So,
yeah,
right.
I know. Yeah.
And people who are not real have far fewer limits on what they can be and what they can look like and
the filters
what they can,
and
right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that is it's certainly at play. I mean, I think the patience piece is a muscle, right? If you don't, if you're not accustomed to having to have patience,
Hmm.
then why would you all of a sudden have that ability in these other environments? So we're not necessarily like helping anybody cultivate those skills. The more time that we spend in these spaces, that everything feels very immediate. And yeah, I mean, I think the Facebook files, the information that was released by Frances Haugen pretty much sums it up that yes, it is algorithmically designed to make you feel FOMO and to
Hmm.
make you
Hmm.
feel bad about themselves. And they know that when they turn those dials just a little bit, that um, it keeps people on the platform longer, even if it's bad for them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean I guess I don't know the details of the Facebook files, but I think that part of the scariness here is that it's just sort of baked into the logic of these organizations, right? There may also be kind of nefarious things going on and people being aware of ethical infractions they ought to have acted upon, but it's also just like, yeah, if you make attention the commodity, then uh,
Hmm.
there's going to be a sort of relentless extracting of people's attention,
Yeah. Yeah.
regardless of what they really want. Yeah.
I have an anecdote uh, to add to this. So I've been teaching high school theater for the last 25 years,
All right.
and so I do an exercise where I usually start the year and I'm having kids just walk around the room, and I just say, just walk around the room, and usually they're kind of just walking, in a circle, kind of at the same pace, in the same direction, and I give them a cue and I just say, I want you to do something to engage yourself in this activity of walking around. And in the last maybe 5 years, um, whenever I say that, whoever has their phone in their back pocket,
Mhm.
like all of a sudden they'll take their phones out. And so for them to engage themselves in the act of walking
Is
means
to
to distract themselves with their phone
right, right. Yeah,
rather
fascinating.
than, make a choice physically that actually engages them.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, which is
Wow.
just yeah.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
there was
fascinating.
another exercise I do that reminded me of, in the book when you go and, look at the picture for 3 hours, the painting, I do an exercise where each kid has a chair, and I give them 45 minutes, and they have to find as many different ways of sitting in that chair as they
Hmm.
can. And they have 45 minutes, and so it's like, they're like, "How many different ways can I sit?" But so
Right. You
eventually
mean they have to do it for 45 minutes,
they
right?
have to do it for
They don't have
45
any
minutes.
less than 45. Right. Yeah. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So they can change the chair and they don't have to sit on it. Like sit is a pretty loose term.
Yeah.
They can stand on it and different things. But it's very interesting to see. And it's active. So for them, like they could never sit and look at a painting for 3 hours.
Right.
Like they
Right.
just couldn't do it.
Right.
But because they're physically involved in the process that, this extended activity, they seem
Yeah.
to get to
And
that
it
same kind of point. Yeah.
right, and it stimulates a kind of new kind of creativity because something
Yeah.
is removed. The option of walking away from it is removed. I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. It's fun.
Do you have a question, Kelly? I've got one. If I you want me to go?
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just curious. How has uh, writing this book and the reception to this book um, changed your life, and also like changed your relationship to time? And now you have people like us fangirls, asking you to be on podcasts and whatnot.
I mean, yeah, I think it feels like a very sort of uh, humdrum response to that great question, but actually, yeah, it's just like part of what I'm getting at in the book is 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 how we negotiate the fact that there are sort of more demands, more potential opportunities, more things that would be fun to do, more things that feels important uh, to do from on ethical grounds, whatever it is, than we can get our arms around. And yeah, one of the results of the sort of surprising success, to me anyway, of this book has been that it just sort of takes all those issues and turns them up a notch. So like I've got a whole section in the book on like finding peace with having too much email, and then I was like, okay, I didn't really know what too much email meant before that. And as again, the specific way in which something going right, or two things. One is the way that something going right can be a source of a kind of stress, because you feel like, to me anyway, I'm always like, well, something I ought to be doing to respond to this fact, right? Or some opportunity I ought to be seizing. It's like, so it's also just a ridiculous and classic example of like finding the cloud in the silver lining, or whatever. But also then the way in which this problem of finitude and of needing to sort of reconcile ourselves to our limitations, it doesn't go away to the extent that things you do are successful. It gets worse to the extent that things you do are successful, because the proportion of opportunities coming one's way that are good and exciting increases a little bit. I'm in this persistent, strange state, right, of being sort of having a very tortured relationship with email. I'm finding ways around this, and I think I've reached a certain level of equanimity. And yet the vast, overwhelming majority of the emails that are the cause of this are just lovely and wonderful, and they're either just ego boosting, or they're much more than that. They're people, sharing really sort of personal stories, or recommending fascinating readings that I had not encountered yet. So it's incredibly useful to hear from them. And I love all this stuff, and I hate that I can't get my arms around it. So all these challenges are sort of what's the word I'm looking for? They come back on a new level. But I do know a bit more than I did, having sort of thought my way through these things and tried to sort of live into them a bit. So I am a bit more reconciled to the fact that I'm only going to be able to do a few of the things that one could theoretically do.
On that note, I have a Jesus. I also have to have my Jesus moment in the podcast. So this is my Jesus.
Yeah, I was going to say, I thought there might be more of them.
So I heard a sermon once that kind of had the same effect on me as Erin's friend who quit her job after she read your book. And it was a sermon about Jesus calling people, or when he was calling the disciples and telling them, drop your nets, follow me. And the disciples like, I got to bury my father. And then the one's like, I got to go say goodbye to my family. I got to do this. And they all had these really good things. And Jesus is like, no, you can't do it. Just come with me. Just drop it. Come with me. And, looking at that, you're like, Jesus is a jerk. I mean, pretty jerky here to like demand this of people. Right. Like burying your father is a important thing. And what this sermon said, which I had never heard this passage described this way, is that there are all kinds of good things in our lives, but we only have the capacity for so much. And sometimes we have to let go of good things in order to take on something new.
Right. And that it isn't a judgment against the thing you're not doing to do the thing that you do. Right.
Yeah. And I think in the sermon, it was like, there might be something better. And it might not even be, and I think kind of what you say is, it might not even be better. It just might be the thing that you need to do now.
Right. The thing that is appropriate to this specific moment. Yeah. He had some wise ideas that.
Right. I know. The other kind of, this is kind of a totally not Jesus moment, but the other piece, there's a theater director named Anne Bogart, and she writes a book called just On Directing. And the first thing she says is directing is a violent act. And this is kind of the opposite of Jesus, but the same story. And she says, because as a director, when you decide the chair is going to go here and is going to face this way, you negate all other options for where that chair can be. And so that it's almost an act of violence to make a decision.
Yeah.
Which I think is
That's really interesting. And what that reminds me of is how frequently people who've read there are people who, anyone who's really into improvisation apparently becomes like a huge evangelist for improvisation. So I've not been to improv classes or anything like that, but many times people are like, yeah, no, you should really try improvisation because it all goes to the heart of this stuff. So that's
Yeah.
maybe the flip side of what you're talking about there. Yeah.
Yeah. Erin, do
All
you want to
right.
move to our last question?
We've got one more question for you, and I'm looking at
Sure.
the time, so
We're
we
gonna
keep
land the
be
plane.
respectful of your time.
Oh,
But
thank you.
we're wondering what you're working on now, what your next project is going to be, or is.
Yeah, I'm working on a book that has a working title of Meditations for Mortals, which is intended to sort of take some of these ideas and this broad worldview of sort of embracing finitude and all the sort of freedom that comes from that and fulfillment, and sort of they're meant to be sort of short reflections. They play off a lot of the quotations from various sources that I've been kind of deluged with by readers since the book came out. So it's an attempt to sort of be in conversation with that stuff. It's still taking shape, but I think that there's something really powerful about, I guess in religion, these kinds of things are called things like devotionals, right? It's this idea that there's some benefit in sort of being able to enfold this kind of way of thinking and being into your daily life. It's not intended as a sequel or for people who've only read my other books or anything like that, but it did partly come from this response from some people of like, okay, I get the shift in perspective, but like now what? How do I implement it? And I think on some level that's the wrong question. The answer, the question is something like, how do you sort of spend more time with it, letting it sink into your skin, under your skin. That's the only way I've ever found to sort of deepen this kind of understanding.
Well, I so appreciate how you come at things. And I think I have a better understanding now, having talked to you, that you have such an eclectic background and eclectic things that you're pulling from wisdom wise. When I listened to your interview with Krista Tippett, that was the first time I had heard you.
Right.
And I was so intrigued, and I was like, I'm not usually so obsessed with like, what is somebody's belief system or where is somebody coming from? But I was so curious that I would listen to more than, obviously bought the book and read it. But there is just this really great non-judgmental open stance, I think, in your work that allows for people like me and Erin to both find such wisdom and such, instruction for our lives. So we really appreciate that.
I'm really flattered to hear you say that. That is what I'm sort of aspiring to. So it's lovely if that's what comes across. Yes, I don't know what my belief system is, and it seems to be constantly changing, but I'm kind of fine with that.
Yeah, we were just talking this morning. We were like, maybe one of the things we should ask ourselves is just like, what do I believe today?
Yeah.
Because every day is a little bit different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We've really enjoyed this.
I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very much.
We want to thank our guest, Oliver Burkeman, for sharing his thoughts, his wisdom, and his time with us. We also thank our listeners for joining us for this episode. We hope you took away as much as we have. If you have any show suggestions, questions, or thoughts on the show, feel free to write us at atheist@stlpodcast.com.
Atheist is produced by Justin Seiwell and Trend Media STL. You can follow us and other great podcasts on Instagram at STL Podcasts. Kelley and I both have Substacks that you should check out. The links can be found in the episode description. That's where you'll also find links to Oliver Burkeman's website and some other things we think you'll find interesting. Thank you for listening, and keep looking for connection.